I die!
They stood there knowing the numbers before the first sound of steel ever touched the air. They had counted them. They had watched the horizon darken not with clouds, but with movement. Rows upon rows. Standards rising like a forest that had learned how to march. An empire does not arrive quietly. It announces itself through dust, through the vibration in the ground, through the certainty that resistance is irrational. Any rational observer would have called what followed impossible. Any strategist would have dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Any historian, looking backward, would struggle to explain how the arithmetic failed so completely. 3,000 is not a symbolic number. It is not poetic. It is not even impressive by the standards of war. It is a number associated with patrols, with garrisons, with forces meant to delay rather than decide. It is the kind of number written in the margins of battle plans, not at the center of them. Empires do not fear 3,000. They absorb them. They crush them. They erase them and move on without adjusting their schedules. And yet, on that day, something stalled. This was not a last stand born of desperation. It did not begin with speeches carved from legend or with men expecting to die for memory. It began with routine. Orders delivered in measured tones. Equipment checked by habit rather than hope. The quiet confidence of a force that understood its role was limited, but its duty was not. No one there believed they were about to rewrite anything. They believed they were buying time. That was all. Across from them stood a machine refined over generations. Not merely an army, but an institution that had already consumed cities, cultures, and kings. Its commanders were educated in logistics, its officers trained in psychological domination long before the first blade was drawn. It did not rely on courage alone. It relied on certainty. Certainty that the world bent in one direction when it arrived. Certainty that resistance collapsed under weight, if not immediately, then inevitably. The empire had statistics on its side. Supply lines that stretched farther than memory. Reserves that could replace losses without emotion. Experience gained not from theory, but from repetition. Every campaign reinforced the same lesson: numbers were not just strength, they were inevitability. When such a force advanced, the question was never if it would win, only how long it would take. That assumption shaped everything. It shaped how orders were given. It shaped how quickly they moved. It shaped what they did not bother to prepare for. Empires, by their nature, do not rehearse humiliation. They do not imagine scenarios where the smaller force dictates the tempo. They do not design contingencies for the moment when confidence becomes a liability. The 3,000 understood something different. Not courage. Not destiny. Something colder. Something quieter. They understood that the empire's greatest weapon was not steel or numbers, but expectation. Expectation of obedience. Expectation of fear. Expectation that the world would react the way it always had. That expectation was as rigid as doctrine. And rigidity, under pressure, does not bend. It fractures. The ground beneath them mattered. Not because it was sacred or symbolic, but because it constrained movement. Space, in war, is psychology made physical. Width gives confidence. Narrowness creates doubt. The empire had mastered open fields, sweeping advances, overwhelming presence. But here, presence was compressed. Power was forced into a corridor where it could not fully express itself. And when power cannot display itself, it begins to question itself. Still, none of this should have been enough. This is the uncomfortable part. The part that resists clean explanation. Even with terrain, even with discipline, even with preparation, the imbalance remained grotesque. One side could replace losses endlessly. The other could not. One side could afford mistakes. The other could not survive a single one. Every calculation still favored the empire. Every precedent agreed. And yet, as the hours passed, something subtle began to shift. Not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those watching. The Empire's soldiers did not panic. That would have been understandable. They did something more dangerous. They hesitated. Not long. Not visibly. Just enough for uncertainty to slip in. Enough for questions to form that doctrine had never taught them how to silence. Why was this taking longer than it should? Why was resistance still organized? Why did the smaller force look prepared rather than desperate? History often disguises its turning points as delays. As minor disruptions. As moments that seem inconsequential until viewed in reverse. At the time, no one there would have said they were witnessing something extraordinary. They would have described it as frustrating. As inefficient. As unexpectedly costly. Empires do not recognize danger when it wears the face of inconvenience. The 3,000 felt the pressure differently. For them, every moment was survival stretched thin. Every sound carried meaning. Every movement was calculated. There was no illusion of safety. But there was clarity. A clarity that comes when there is no room for fantasy. When retreat is not an option worth discussing. When victory is redefined not as conquest, but as endurance. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable for those who prefer history clean and orderly. Because what followed was not a miracle. It was not luck. It was not a sudden collapse of an inferior force. It was a slow unraveling of assumptions. A confrontation between certainty and adaptability. Between scale and precision. Between an empire that believed it could not lose, and a small force that knew exactly how fragile that belief was. The imbalance did not disappear. It remained, towering and undeniable. But imbalance alone does not decide outcomes. It only creates expectations. And expectations, once broken, are difficult to repair under pressure. What happened next would not be understood correctly for generations. It would be simplified. Romanticized. Reduced to slogans and symbols that missed the point entirely. The real lesson would be buried beneath numbers and myths, ignored because it threatened a comforting narrative about power and inevitability. 3,000 against an empire is not a story about bravery. It is a story about perception. About how systems fail not when they are weak, but when they are too certain of their strength. About how the smallest force, under the right conditions, can expose the hidden flaws of something that appears unstoppable. And the most dangerous moment was still ahead. To understand why this confrontation mattered, the record has to be opened slowly, without romance, without the benefit of hindsight. Long before steel met shield, the world in which this moment formed was already uneven. Power, at that time, was not abstract. It was visible. It marched across maps. It consumed territory not only with armies, but with systems. Laws, tribute, roads, languages. This was an age when dominance meant permanence, and resistance was usually remembered only as a delay. The empire at the center of this story was not a regional power testing its limits. It was the largest political entity the known world had yet seen, the Achaemenid Empire. Its reach extended from the Indus Valley to the edges of the Aegean. It governed through a combination of tolerance and terror, allowing local customs to survive so long as obedience and tribute flowed uninterrupted. Rebellion was rare not because it was impossible, but because it was irrational. The empire's resources dwarfed those of any single opponent. Its armies were not raised for one campaign and then dissolved. They were institutional, replenished, and continuously refined. Opposing this expansion was not a united nation, but a fractured cultural sphere. The Greek world was divided into independent city-states, each with its own interests, rivalries, and definitions of honor. Cooperation was fragile. Trust was conditional. Even when faced with external threats, unity required persuasion, fear, or both. There was no central authority capable of commanding collective action. What existed instead were traditions, alliances, and a shared but inconsistently applied sense of identity. Among these city-states, one stood apart in reputation and method: Sparta. It was not wealthy in the conventional sense. It did not produce great art or architecture compared to its peers. What it cultivated was discipline. From childhood, its citizens were shaped by a system designed not to create thinkers or traders, but soldiers. The Spartan state was built around the assumption that survival depended on readiness, and readiness required sacrifice long before war ever arrived. But even Sparta did not exist in isolation. Its influence was regional, its numbers limited. It could inspire allies, intimidate rivals, and dominate local conflicts, but it was not built to confront an empire. No Greek city-state was. When news arrived that the Persian advance was moving westward again, the response across Greece was fragmented. Some cities calculated survival through submission. Others delayed, hoping distance would become protection. A few debated resistance while quietly preparing for compromise. The empire's ruler, Xerxes I, did not see this as a gamble. It was a continuation. His predecessors had already demonstrated that Greek resistance could be punished, corrected, and absorbed. The objective was not annihilation. It was demonstration. To show, unmistakably, that defiance carried consequences, and that accommodation was the only rational policy. When the empire moved, it did so with the confidence of precedent. Geography forced the issue. There were only so many routes by which a massive army could move into southern Greece. One of them ran through a narrow coastal pass where mountains pressed close to the sea, a place called Thermopylae. It was not chosen for drama. It was chosen because it constrained scale. Where numbers could not fully deploy, organization mattered more than size. Where cavalry lost relevance, infantry discipline became decisive. The pass had been fought over before. It was known. It was measurable. The Greek response, such as it was, formed around delay rather than victory. The objective was time. Time for cities to decide. Time for alliances to solidify. Time for naval forces to maneuver elsewhere. This was not framed as a final defense, but as a necessary obstruction. Someone had to stand there. Someone had to slow the advance long enough for strategy to catch up with reality. Command fell to Leonidas I, a man shaped by the Spartan system but not blind to its limitations. He understood numbers. He understood symbolism. He also understood psychology, though that word would not have existed in his vocabulary. What mattered was not merely holding ground, but shaping perception. Both for allies watching from a distance, and for the empire advancing with certainty. The force assembled was small by any honest measure. It included Spartans, but also contingents from other Greek cities. They were not identical in training or equipment. They were united not by a shared national identity, but by a temporary alignment of interest. Many of those who marched did not believe they would decide the war. They believed they would influence it indirectly, by altering timing and expectations. Ritual and constraint shaped decisions in ways modern analysis often struggles to account for. Religious observances, political calendars, and internal laws limited how many Spartan citizens could be deployed at that moment. This was not negligence. It was structural rigidity. The Spartan state was optimized for internal stability, not rapid adaptation. What arrived at Thermopylae was not the full weight of Sparta, but a legally permissible fragment of it. From the Persian perspective, this opposition registered as an obstacle, not a threat. Reports describe disciplined troops, yes, but few in number. The assumption was straightforward: resistance would collapse after demonstration. The empire had encountered bravery before. It had encountered stubbornness. Neither had altered outcomes. The expectation was compliance after shock. Both sides entered the pass carrying assumptions that would soon be tested. One side believed numbers would compress resistance into irrelevance. The other believed discipline could stretch time beyond what arithmetic suggested. Neither side fully understood how those beliefs would interact under pressure. This is the critical context often lost. The confrontation was not framed as destiny versus oppression, or freedom versus tyranny. It was a calculated delay set against a calculated advance. A narrow strip of land where two systems, built on entirely different logics, were about to test which assumptions mattered more when certainty met constraint. What followed would expose not just tactical strengths and weaknesses, but deeper flaws in how power understands itself when it becomes too accustomed to winning. The imbalance revealed itself long before the first clash, not through violence, but through waiting. Waiting is where fear multiplies. For the smaller force, waiting meant watching dust rise endlessly on the horizon, each plume signaling another column, another unit, another reminder of scale. For the empire, waiting was an irritation. Time, to them, was an asset they owned. Delays were acceptable because outcomes were assumed. The pass itself enforced intimacy. There was no sweeping maneuver, no grand deployment. Men stood close enough to hear each other breathe, close enough to feel the weight of armor shift with every movement. The sea pressed against one flank, the mountains against the other. The space reduced options. Strategy became geometry. Courage became endurance. The Persian advance did not begin with urgency. That, in retrospect, is revealing. Commanders expected submission once presence was established. They had seen it countless times before. Cities folded when they understood resistance was symbolic at best and suicidal at worst. When that did not happen, the empire adjusted, but only incrementally. There was no rush to innovate because there was no perceived need. The first probes were cautious, almost dismissive. Light infantry testing reactions. Archers gauging distance and density. These were not meant to decide anything. They were meant to measure. What they encountered was not panic, but stillness. Shields locked. Feet planted. No pursuit, no retreat. Just containment. Every movement by the smaller force was economical, almost restrained, as if conserving not energy, but intention. This restraint began to distort expectations. Persian troops were accustomed to opponents who broke formation under pressure, who surged forward too eagerly or scattered when overwhelmed. Here, neither happened. Contact resulted in compression. Push met push. Momentum dissolved into resistance. Losses accumulated in a way that felt disproportionate to effort. Numbers, under these conditions, became a liability. The narrowness of the pass meant only so many could engage at once. Reinforcements queued behind the front line, unable to contribute but fully aware of casualties ahead. This created a psychological bottleneck. Men waited their turn not knowing if it was meaningful. In large armies, anonymity often protects morale. Here, proximity did the opposite. The Greeks, particularly the Spartans, exploited rhythm. Engagements were not continuous. They rotated, withdrew in order, returned in formation. To an observer unfamiliar with disciplined infantry, these movements could be mistaken for weakness. To those trained in formation warfare, they were unsettling. Withdrawal did not signal collapse. It signaled control. As hours stretched into days, pressure mounted unevenly. For the Greeks, fatigue was physical but focused. They knew exactly why they were there. Their objective was narrow: hold, delay, deny passage. Success was measurable in time gained, not enemies destroyed. For the Persians, fatigue was psychological. Every failed push contradicted assumption. Every delay chipped away at inevitability. The empire escalated methodically. Better troops replaced earlier units. Elite formations were committed. Among them were the Persian immortals, soldiers whose reputation alone was meant to break resistance. Their presence signaled seriousness. It also revealed something unintended, that earlier efforts had been insufficient. When even these forces struggled to gain ground, frustration began to surface. Not panic, not fear, but confusion. Doctrine had not prepared them for a situation where superiority could not be expressed fully. Orders emphasized pressure, but pressure required space. Space did not exist. The Greeks understood this intuitively. Their formation was not designed to chase or encircle. It was designed to deny. Shields overlapped. Spears thrust from behind the safety of bronze and wood. Losses occurred, but they were absorbed into formation rather than amplified by disorder. Discipline functioned as a psychological shield as much as a physical one. What made the tension unbearable was not the fighting itself, but the implication. If a force this small could stall an empire here, even temporarily, what did that say about future encounters? Empires survive on the belief that resistance is futile. Once that belief wavers, control requires far more than armies. From the Persian perspective, the problem was reframed. This was no longer about breaking a line. It was about restoring narrative. Victory had to be decisive, visible, unquestionable. Delay threatened more than schedule. It threatened reputation. And reputation, in imperial systems, is currency. As casualties mounted, commanders searched for explanations that preserved certainty. Terrain became the excuse. Unusual enemy discipline became an anomaly. There was little introspection. No one wanted to suggest that doctrine itself might be insufficient. Empires rarely question their foundations during expansion. They correct around them. Meanwhile, the Greeks faced their own internal strain. Supplies were finite. Numbers irreplaceable. Every fallen man mattered disproportionately. There was no illusion of survival if the line broke. This clarity sharpened focus. Fear existed, but it was contained within structure. Individual survival instincts were subordinated to collective endurance. The imbalance persisted, but its meaning shifted. Numbers no longer guaranteed progress. Discipline no longer belonged exclusively to the larger force. The past transformed scale into constraint, turning mass into congestion. Each failed assault reinforced a quiet truth neither side articulated openly: something here was not behaving as expected. This is where tension thickened. Not because defeat loomed immediately for either side, but because the situation defied resolution through standard means. One side could not advance without adapting. The other could not retreat without collapsing purpose. Both were locked into roles they had not anticipated playing for this long. History often frames tension as the approach of violence. Here, violence was constant. The tension came from stagnation. From the realization that power, when compressed, reveals its blind spots. From the dawning awareness that certainty, once shaken, demands explanation. And it was in this atmosphere, of impatience on one side and grim focus on the other, that a single piece of information began to circulate. Quietly. Almost accidentally. Information that would alter the geometry of the pass and the psychology of the conflict entirely. What ultimately changed the course of events did not arrive with trumpets or banners. It did not come from the clash of elites or a sudden collapse of discipline. It arrived as information. Quiet, human, and entirely predictable in retrospect. Empires often fall or succeed not because of strength or weakness, but because of what they learn too late, or what others choose to reveal at precisely the wrong moment. The pass had always been the obvious point of focus. Its narrowness was its value. Its visibility made it defensible. What was less obvious, and far more dangerous, was that the pass was not the only way through. The mountains that pressed against the battlefield were not solid walls. They were complex, cut by paths known to locals, shepherds, traders, and those who lived close enough to understand the land as something navigable rather than symbolic. This was not a secret in the absolute sense. The existence of alternative routes had been known, discussed, and even guarded against. A small detachment had been placed to watch the high ground. But guarding something and truly believing it will be used are very different mental states. The Greeks understood the risk abstractly. The Persians did not initially prioritize it at all. The critical shift occurred when that abstract risk became actionable intelligence. A local man, Ephialtes of Trachis, stepped into history not through grand ambition, but through calculation. His motivations have been debated endlessly: greed, resentment, survival. What matters more than motive is opportunity. Empires create incentives simply by existing. When one side appears inevitable, aligning with it feels rational. Resistance, in contrast, feels temporary. Ephialtes did not bring strategy. He brought geography. He revealed the Anapaea path, a mountain route that bypassed the narrowest point of the pass and descended behind the Greek position. It was not an easy road. It was steep, uneven, and unsuitable for large formations moving quickly. But it did not need to be elegant. It only needed to exist. For the Persian command, this information was not immediately processed as genius. It was processed as relief. A solution that restored familiar logic. Instead of confronting the Greek formation head-on, they could render it irrelevant. Not by breaking it, but by surrounding it. This aligned perfectly with imperial doctrine. Why absorb losses when maneuver could achieve the same result? The decision to act on this intelligence revealed something deeper than tactical flexibility. It exposed how much the empire relied on indirect solutions once direct dominance failed to deliver immediate results. Power prefers shortcuts when resistance proves costly. This was not cowardice. It was efficiency. But efficiency carries assumptions, and assumptions shape outcomes. The force sent along the mountain path was significant but not overwhelming. Movement was conducted under cover of darkness, through terrain that limited communication and cohesion. This was a risk. But it was a calculated one. The Greeks guarding the path were surprised, overwhelmed not by numbers alone, but by expectation failure. They had been assigned a duty many believed would never be tested seriously. When it was, reaction lagged behind reality. Word traveled back down the mountain slowly. Too slowly. When the news reached the main Greek force, there was no confusion about its meaning. No debate about alternatives. The situation had shifted from delay to encirclement. The geometry that had protected them was about to invert. What had been a shield would become a trap. Here is where history often simplifies events into inevitability. But inevitability is a narrative applied after decisions are made. At that moment, options still existed. Withdrawal was possible for some. Reorganization could have preserved manpower. The broader war could still benefit from living soldiers rather than symbolic deaths. The choice made next is often misunderstood because it is framed as romantic fatalism. It was not. It was strategic triage. Leonidas understood that a full withdrawal under pressure would collapse cohesion. Panic spreads faster than orders. A retreat through the same narrow pass, now threatened from behind, would risk annihilation rather than survival. Instead, he divided the problem. Those whose continued survival mattered for future defense were dismissed. They were ordered to leave while movement was still possible. What remained was not a last stand in the theatrical sense. It was a redefinition of purpose. The remaining force accepted that their role had changed from delaying an advance to anchoring it. Every moment they held would prevent the encircling force from fully coordinating. Every casualty inflicted would complicate timing. Every act of resistance would buy fragments of time elsewhere. This decision reveals the hidden brilliance often overshadowed by myth. Sacrifice was not the objective. Control was. By staying, the Greeks fixed Persian attention. They forced the empire to commit resources to finishing what should have been finished already. They turned encirclement into another form of delay. For the Persians, the discovery of the path was a victory. But it was not a clean one. It required adaptation under pressure, coordination across difficult terrain, and reliance on local knowledge, something imperial armies often devalue. The solution worked, but it introduced new variables. Variables that could not be perfectly managed. This is the irony at the heart of the hidden turn. The information that broke the tactical deadlock also exposed the empire's dependence on solutions outside its preferred doctrine. It won the position, but not the narrative. It succeeded, but not cleanly. The delay had already done its work. The mountain path did more than change the battlefield. It altered the psychological framing of the conflict. For the Greeks, it clarified the endgame. For the Persians, it complicated victory. The empire would prevail at Thermopylae, but not in the way it expected, and not without cost far beyond the pass itself. What followed would cement that cost in blood and memory, transforming a tactical success into a strategic complication the empire would struggle to contain. The final phase did not begin with chaos. It began with clarity. When dawn broke, the air carried a different weight. Those who remained understood the shape of what was coming, not because they had been told, but because every sound confirmed it. Movement in the rear. Signals passed along unfamiliar routes. The empire was no longer contained by the geometry of the pass. It was closing in from directions that had never mattered before. There were no speeches meant for history. No declarations aimed at memory. Orders were practical, almost mundane. Shields adjusted. Lines tightened. Positions were chosen not for glory, but for efficiency. This was not the psychology of men seeking death. It was the psychology of men who understood time had become the most valuable weapon they still possessed. The Persians advanced differently now. Confidence had returned, but it was sharpened by irritation. This resistance had already cost more than it should have. The objective was no longer simply passage. It was erasure. The smaller force needed to be removed decisively, visibly, in a way that restored the hierarchy of power. Anything less would allow doubt to travel faster than armies. Assaults intensified. Archers darkened the sky, not as a primary killing tool, but as pressure. Noise increased. Commands overlapped. The confined space amplified everything: impact, screams, the metallic rhythm of contact. The Greeks responded as they had before, but with a subtle shift. There was no longer a need to conserve. Every engagement now had a singular purpose: hold until holding was no longer possible. The line bent, but did not break. Formation absorbed shock. Losses mounted on both sides, but the arithmetic no longer mattered. What mattered was friction. Every fallen man slowed movement. Every stalled unit disrupted coordination. The empire's advantage depended on flow, units rotating, reinforcements feeding forward. That flow was repeatedly interrupted by resistance that refused to dissolve. At close quarters, scale loses meaning. Individual skill resurfaces. Discipline becomes visible. The Greeks pressed forward when retreat would have been safer, not out of recklessness, but to compress space further. To deny the enemy room to deploy. To turn encirclement into congestion. This was not sustainable, but sustainability was no longer the metric. From the Persian perspective, the scene was both victory and embarrassment. They were winning, but not efficiently. Not cleanly. Not in the way imperial narratives prefer to be told. Each advance came at a cost that felt unnecessary given the imbalance. Each fallen Greek delayed closure. Each moment prolonged the visibility of resistance. Commanders pushed harder. Orders became sharper, less patient. Units were committed not because they were needed tactically, but because the situation demanded finality. The empire needed this to end. Prolongation itself had become a threat. As pressure intensified, cohesion among the Greeks finally began to fracture, not from fear, but from depletion. Shields splintered. Spears broke. Wounded men fought on, not because they believed it would change the outcome, but because stopping would accelerate it. The line compressed into smaller knots of resistance, each one functioning independently, yet aligned by instinct rather than command. This was the moment where myth often intrudes. Where later generations insert poetry and destiny. What actually unfolded was harsher and more mechanical. Bodies accumulated. Terrain became uneven, slick, obstructive. Movement slowed for everyone. The empire's numbers, so overwhelming in the abstract, now struggled against the physical reality of space choked with the consequences of its own advance. The encircling forces finally pressed fully into position. Attacks came from multiple directions. The Greeks were forced inward, collapsing around a central point not chosen for symbolism, but because it was the last defensible ground available. There was no illusion left. Only function. At some point, leadership ceased to matter. Not because it failed, but because systems took over. Training replaced instruction. Habit replaced command. Men fought the way they had been conditioned to fight, without expectation of reinforcement or reprieve. The battlefield narrowed not just physically, but psychologically. The world reduced to immediate threats and immediate responses. For the Persians, the final moments were brutal and costly. They achieved dominance, but not dominance that inspired awe. What they saw instead was defiance stripped of hope, resistance divorced from strategy, and endurance that refused to negotiate. This kind of opposition is unsettling precisely because it offers no incentive. There is nothing to bargain with. Nothing to threaten. Eventually, resistance ceased, not because it surrendered, but because it was exhausted beyond continuation. The last engagements were less battles than collisions between remaining bodies and advancing mass. When it ended, it did so without ceremony. No single moment marked the conclusion. The fighting simply ran out of defenders. Silence followed, heavy and disordered. The pass was taken. The path south lay open. By every conventional measure, the empire had achieved its objective. And yet, something was wrong. The cost had been visible. The delay undeniable. The story, already spreading beyond the battlefield, was not one of effortless domination. Victory had been secured, but certainty had been damaged. Those who survived on the Persian side carried more than fatigue forward. They carried memory. Memory of a force that should have collapsed earlier. Memory of resistance that refused to behave according to scale. Memory that would influence expectations in battles yet to come. The climax at the pass was not the end of the conflict. It was the point at which the meaning of the conflict changed. What had begun as a calculated delay had transformed into a narrative fracture. The empire moved on, but it did so altered, forced to reconcile success with discomfort. And that discomfort would echo far beyond the bodies left behind, shaping decisions in ways not immediately visible, but deeply consequential. After the pass fell, the empire did what empires are designed to do. It moved forward. Roads were cleared. Supply lines advanced. Messages were sent ahead announcing inevitability. From a purely operational standpoint, nothing catastrophic had occurred. The army remained vast. The command structure intact. The objective of breaking through the northern gate into Greece had been achieved. Any empire that paused to mourn inefficiency would never expand. Momentum had to be preserved. But momentum is not just physical. It is psychological. And that was where the damage lingered. The delay at the pass had bought more than time. It had bought coordination. While the empire was forced to concentrate attention and resources on a narrow strip of land, decisions were being made elsewhere. Fleets repositioned. Alliances hardened. Cities that had hesitated now committed, not because they believed they could win alone, but because the empire no longer felt abstract. It had been slowed. And anything that can be slowed can, under the right conditions, be stopped. The narrative traveling ahead of the Persian army was no longer uniform. Yes, the pass had fallen. Yes, resistance had been crushed. But the cost was discussed in whispers. The unexpected casualties. The stubbornness. The fact that a small force had dictated terms for days. This mattered in a world where reputation often arrived before armies. Submission is easier when fear is clean and absolute. When fear is mixed with doubt, calculation changes. As the empire advanced southward, cities reacted differently than anticipated. Some evacuated rather than surrender. Others prepared defenses rather than negotiating terms. The assumption that demonstration alone would compel obedience no longer held universally. Resistance had acquired precedent. This shift mattered most at sea. The Greek naval forces, operating independently of the land confrontation, benefited directly from the time purchased at the pass. Crews trained. Command structures clarified. Strategic debates narrowed into executable plans. The confrontation that followed at Salamis was not an accident or a miracle. It was the product of alignment made possible by delay. At Salamis, the empire faced a problem similar in structure to the one it had encountered on land, but magnified. Narrow waters constrained numbers. Large formations lost flexibility. Communication broke down under pressure. Once again, scale became congestion. Once again, superiority struggled to express itself fully. The result was not merely a defeat. It was a reversal of expectation. Naval power, once assumed decisive, proved vulnerable to coordination and terrain. The loss was visible, undeniable, and impossible to reframe as inconsequential. Ships burned. Crews drowned. The spectacle traveled faster than explanation. This forced a recalibration. Empires tolerate losses when they fit narrative. What they cannot tolerate are losses that contradict doctrine. The Persian command adjusted its posture, withdrawing portions of its forces, consolidating control rather than pressing deeper immediately. This was not retreat in the dramatic sense, but it was restraint. And restraint signaled uncertainty. The following year, the conflict culminated on land at Plataea, where the Greek coalition, now more unified and confident, confronted Persian forces under conditions far less favorable to imperial dominance. The outcome there would confirm what Thermopylae had suggested quietly and Salamis had announced loudly: the empire could be resisted successfully when its assumptions were exploited. Thermopylae itself did not win these battles. But it shaped them. It altered decision-making timelines. It hardened alliances. It provided a psychological anchor around which resistance could organize. The memory of 3,000 holding back an empire became a reference point, not because of the death, but because of the delay. Because it proved that the machine could be forced to adapt. For the Persian Empire, the campaign marked a boundary. Expansion into mainland Greece would not proceed as smoothly as anticipated. The cost-benefit calculation shifted. Control of existing territories took precedence over ambitious westward absorption. The empire remained powerful, vast, and influential, but its aura of effortless inevitability had been compromised. For the Greek world, the aftermath was equally complex. Unity forged under pressure did not last indefinitely. Old rivalries resurfaced. Power struggles followed. Victory did not create harmony. But it did create confidence. A belief that collective action, under the right conditions, could alter outcomes even against overwhelming force. This confidence would have consequences far beyond the immediate conflict. It would shape political experimentation, military doctrine, and cultural self-perception. The idea that disciplined citizens could defend autonomy against empires became embedded in Greek identity, influencing how these societies understood themselves and their place in the world. Thermopylae, stripped of myth, stands as a lesson in indirect impact. It reminds us that not all victories are measured in territory gained or enemies destroyed. Some are measured in time bought, assumptions shattered, and narratives disrupted. The men who held the past did not live to see the outcomes their actions enabled. But history does not require witnesses to function. The empire moved on. The world changed. And the consequences of that narrow delay continue to ripple outward, shaping decisions long after the bodies had been cleared and the road reopened. What remains, after the dust settles and the campaigns conclude, is not just a sequence of events, but a question. A question about how power understands resistance, and how resistance understands itself when survival depends not on winning, but on enduring just long enough to change the game. What this confrontation ultimately exposes is not a paradox of courage, but a flaw in how human systems interpret strength. Power, especially when accumulated over time, develops habits. It learns what usually works and begins to confuse repetition with truth. The empire did not fail because it lacked resources, intelligence, or discipline. It faltered because it trusted those things too completely. Certainty became its blind spot. 3,000 did not defeat an empire. That framing is seductive, but misleading. What they defeated was an assumption. The assumption that scale always overrides structure. That fear always precedes resistance. That time belongs to the larger force by default. Once that assumption cracked, everything built on top of it became negotiable. This is the psychological core of the event. Human beings do not respond to power in absolute terms. They respond to signals, to patterns, to precedent. When resistance appears futile, compliance feels rational. When resistance proves durable, even briefly, calculation changes. People begin to ask different questions. Not, can we win, but what if we don't lose immediately? That shift is small, but it is dangerous for any system that depends on inevitability. Empires understand this intuitively, which is why they invest so heavily in spectacle. Marches, banners, overwhelming displays are not just military tools, they are psychological ones. They are meant to compress the future into a single visible conclusion. Thermopylae disrupted that compression. It stretched the future open, just enough for alternatives to enter the conversation. The defenders understood something equally important about themselves. They did not mistake endurance for victory. They did not confuse sacrifice with success. Their actions were not driven by the belief that they would survive or even prevail in the immediate sense. They were driven by clarity of role. They knew exactly what their presence needed to accomplish and, just as importantly, what it did not. This clarity is rare. Most failures, individual or systemic, arise not from lack of strength, but from confusion of purpose. When goals blur, effort scatters. When effort scatters, scale becomes waste. The small force avoided this trap by narrowing its definition of success until it became achievable under any outcome. Hold. Delay. Disrupt. Nothing more. There is a temptation to interpret this as moral superiority or exceptional bravery. That interpretation flatters modern sensibilities, but it obscures the lesson. Bravery without structure collapses quickly. What mattered here was discipline applied to a limited objective. The willingness to accept loss in service of function, rather than ideology. That is not romantic. It is cold. And it is effective. The empire, by contrast, was forced to adapt reactively. Each adjustment solved a problem while creating another. Bypassing the pass won the position but complicated the campaign. Overcommitting to restore narrative exposed vulnerabilities elsewhere. Victory became expensive, and expense eroded confidence. Not enough to collapse the system, but enough to change its behavior. This is how large systems actually fail, not in sudden implosions, but in incremental recalibrations driven by discomfort. They become cautious where they were bold. Defensive where they were expansive. The shift is often invisible in the moment, but unmistakable in retrospect. For the Greek world, the lesson cut both ways. Success bred confidence, but also competition. Unity achieved under existential threat dissolved once the pressure eased. Power redistributed. Conflicts followed. The same psychological mechanisms that enabled resistance against an external empire fueled rivalry internally. Human nature does not stabilize simply because it survives. And yet, something durable remained. A memory. A reference point. Not of invincibility, but of possibility. The knowledge that even overwhelming systems can be influenced by disciplined resistance applied at the right pressure points. That history is not only written by those who win outright, but by those who force winners to change. This insight extends far beyond warfare. Organizations, governments, cultures, even individuals operate on assumptions about what cannot be challenged. These assumptions persist not because they are always true, but because they are rarely tested under disciplined conditions. When they are, the results are often disproportionate. 3,000 at a narrow pass remind us that leverage matters more than mass, that timing can outweigh force, and that endurance, when aligned with purpose, can reshape outcomes far beyond its immediate scope. They remind us that power is most vulnerable when it stops imagining resistance as intelligent. History remembers the empire as vast and dominant, and it was. But it also remembers the delay, the inconvenience, the unexpected cost. Because those moments reveal something universal, strength that cannot tolerate disruption is already fragile. In the end, the most dangerous thing a small force can do to a great power is not to defeat it, but to force it to doubt itself.